Welcome back, dear viewers. On our show for our second segment, we have Sinthujan Varatharajah from the London School of Economics. He presented yesterday at the University of Toronto's annual Tamil Studies Conference. His paper was a study of caste in the Ula Tamil Diaspora. Sinthujan is completing his master's in race, ethnicity, and post-colonial studies at LSE. So Sinthujan, your presentation was very well received yesterday at the Tamil Studies Conference, with the majority of the questions going to you. And it was an interesting topic that you've chosen, which proved to be somewhat controversial. It was the study of caste in our community, our Ulam Tamil diaspora. What prompted you to study this? Why did you feel it was important?
I thought it was important because caste used to be historically always a very major component of our societal interactions, and it has always remained silent. And even though there were subtle and overt forms of caste discrimination, caste performances that were part of Tamil culture, but the moment that Tamils started to migrate into diaspora, the dialogue and discourse on caste was entirely silenced. Silenced due to the fact that we were facing situations of being refugees out of the country, as well as having the conflict back home, and struggling on different ends and means in the outside as well as in the inside of the country.
And what were some of the findings? I understand you had created an online survey which was anonymous, which allows people to say their true opinions and thoughts on caste. You had about 708 participants. What were a few of the major findings from your survey?
Well, the major findings of the survey were that because of the fact that only a particular kind of population was accessing the survey, there was already a bias in the results itself. So caste in itself seemed to be less important because of the fact that most of the people who participated in the survey were of a particular caste heritage, which was an upper caste Velara caste heritage. Almost 78 or I think 86% of the 86 actually percent of the participants were Velara. That means there is a particular caste privilege and also caste obliviousness towards the issues that are still intrinsic to our society, because caste pride is pretty much silenced and is only exerted from a certain part of society, whereas caste privilege also influences caste blindness as well as the exercise of caste discrimination towards those who are from the lower caste strata.
Okay. And there were different categories. You asked your participants to answer how caste affects their relationships. What were those categories, and which was the most significant?
Well, I separated between friends, acquaintances, colleagues, as well as girlfriend, boyfriend, as well as marital partner. And you could see that the amount of the consciousness towards caste differences and caste identities rose the closer you actually approached the status of marriage. So participants were more aware of caste differences and caste identities once you actually approach the issue of marriage. Whereas when it comes to friendships or simple cooperations in the working world, caste was no more as much of a relevant factor as in the instance of marriage and relationships.
And the majority of the participants, what age group were they in?
They were pretty much 80% of them were between 34 or below. So it was a very, very young population that participated in the survey.
Okay. What are some of the other important, from your own analysis, to what extent is caste configured in our generation's relationships with other people of our background?
It seems to be that caste is very invisible and it's only exercised and articulated in very selective instances. So it's not particularly a daily part of our life, but it keeps on emerging and re-emerging in particular instances of our lives. For instance, in the aspect of marriage, it seems to be a significant part, but many people do not acknowledge it or are scared of acknowledging that whether it's their own caste consciousness and caste identity that influences the decision, or whether it's actually the parents who influences these decisions.
Okay. Were there any interesting, I know you had space for people to comment to give comments. What were some of the more interesting comments people included in their response?
Especially in relation to caste discrimination, there were a lot of examples that were rather unknown. For instance, a lot of people were talking about how caste difference also influences marriage in itself, the premarital stage, as well as the postmarital stage, in the sense that the conflicts that arise between families simply on the fact that one partner in marriage is of a different caste heritage. So there's been a lot of exclusion, a lot of discrimination, a lot of defamation going on. And
were those first generation or second?
Yeah, they were first generation.
First generation.
Yeah. And a lot of separations are also happening, and divorces are happening on the basis of caste difference. So people who, at least according to the results, people who believed to actually be able to overcome caste differences were taught different by society as well as by their own family in the way how they treated them. And different examples of caste discrimination were, for instance, that when it comes to the restaurant business in Canada, there were a couple of examples that people were avoiding to go to particular restaurants and catering services simply by the fact that they actually employ people of so-called low-caste origin.
Was there a breakdown between, or differences of significance between participants who responded from Europe, say Germany, Swiss, those European countries, compared to Canada, the US, Australia, England?
Yeah, there were the Anglo-Saxon and Anglophone speaking countries were very dominant in the survey participation. So we only had approximately 50 participants from continental Europe, which excludes Britain. And it was a factor of the way the survey was spread, as well as the way the survey was accepted. And I think there was also a lack of mobilization that was part of the societal construction in continental Europe, which is less developed as, for instance, the British Tamil community or the Canadian Tamil community or the American Tamil community.
And something we were talking earlier offline was, in certain parts of Europe, say Germany, Swiss, Denmark, a lot of our community, our Tamil community, are in a way not connected to the mainstream, like how Tamils are in England, in US, and Canada, where we're part of the fabric within the mainstream society. Whereas in these European countries, they're almost segregated or left to themselves, and thus retain more of the caste identity or the Tamil caste identity from back home. Why do you think that is a result of?
Well, first of all, I think that the majority of people who live in Anglophone countries, like in Canada or the UK, are very much unaware of the fact that policies of integration and multiculturalism are very different. So the social construction as well as the level of social mobility are not as given as they are, for instance, in the UK or in Canada, which are relatively larger.
And by social mobility, their ability to get into the working classes and more...
The opportunities, basically.
Opportunities, is less in those European countries.
They're less, and also the forms of racism and discrimination that you face are much larger. So there's a particular sense of claiming to an identity that is being contested and as well as challenged, but by fact of being unaccepted and unwelcomed in the particular country they live in. So old traditions seem to retain and to be reproduced much larger and to a greater extent than, for instance, in countries where the level of integration and social mobility is much better and more given.
And as a result, what do you feel that those of us here in Canada, we're starting to shed our allegiance to caste, our connection to caste? Or is it still, where would you say it is on the spectrum?
I wouldn't say that necessarily. I mean, the participation was the greatest in Canada, but I think it was also the fact that particular Canadian organizations were endorsing the survey, and it was addressing and circulating amongst Canadian Tamils much larger than in any other Tamil society. But I do think, considering the fact that a lot of the examples of caste discrimination that were described by participants, that caste discrimination is still part of Canadian Tamil society, and it seems to be less visible than in countries like France or Germany. But it's still part of our society.
Was there any indication there is growing support or identification with shedding our caste labels, our caste markers?
Considering the fact that 70%, almost 73% of the participants actually knew their own caste origin, I'm doubting it.
Okay.
But at the same time, some participants were very conscious about not stating their caste identity because they refused to identify themselves in terms of caste.
Dear viewers, if you have any questions or comments to Sinthujan on this very sensitive topic of caste, please call in. We'd love to hear your thoughts and ideas. Our number's on the screen, 416-623-8100. Please call in. Sinthujan, also, while you're conducting this survey, I understand there were some challenges and some criticisms from within our own community against this survey.
Yeah.
What were those challenges?
There were particular forces of resistance that I faced and obstacles, which were coming from different sectors of society, and they had different motivations. Because some of them were nationalists, Tamil nationalists, who were unaccepting towards the idea of identifying ourselves in caste identities, and also to talk about caste and bring the subject back to the social consciousness. And I think their criticism really roots in the idea that silencing caste as an issue will also eradicate caste from the social landscape.
But so they're claiming that if we don't talk about it, we'll get rid of it.
Yes. And at the same time, there was a lot of rejection and condemnation towards the study, and people were trying to either question my integrity or the purpose of the study. And there was a lot of paranoia as well as fear towards the idea that the Sri Lankan government might use it to pretty much apart our community and try to use caste differences in order to intrude our Tamil community and disunify us.
Did you respond to those criticisms, or did you?
No.
Did you feel it just there was no point?
There was no point in responding to these. I mean, I archived them all, and I'm trying to write some paper about it and include it into my evaluation of the survey because it's part of the survey itself and the reaction that is faced by the community. So, and a lot of the people who were actually discouraging from participation were also calling for halts of the survey as well as boycotts of the survey. So it was not just passive resistance, but also active resistance. And I think it's very much embellic for the kind of state of mind our society has and how much we're actually open to the idea of talking about internal issues that we face.
And so is this forming your thesis for your master's?
No, it's not.
Okay,
no.
it was just a study.
Yeah.
Have you given thought to your thesis at the master's level?
Yeah, I do. I'm going to write my thesis basically about Dalit nationalism and black nationalism in America.
Sorry, which?
Dalit nationalism. Dalit nationalism?
Dalit,
yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And black nationalism in America. So it's a comparative approach of how the civil rights movement in America influenced Dalit nationalism in India. And with a specific focus on Black Panther and Dalit Panthers.
Okay, all right. On that, connection with the African American civil rights movement, a few commentators have made some analogies to our situation in Sri Lanka in terms of a non-violent democratic movement for Tamil rights. Do you see any connections with what the African American community went through in the 1960s for civil rights and our community situation now in 2012?
I do see overlaps and I do see similarities, but I do think that comparing both situations does not really suit the situation itself. I also think that the Sri Lankan state in itself is very different to the American state at that point of time. So the forces that were used by the Sri Lankan state and continue to be used to silence Tamil political opinions do need some different forms of resistance from the Tamil community back home.
Okay. What is the nature of the work you're looking to do? Perhaps to give us an idea, you're a growing academic within our community in Europe. What are your thoughts on the line of work that you like to do?
In general? Or?
Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking about doing a PhD soon. So I'm thinking about, because my focus is not really what is happening in Sri Lanka, but rather what is happening in transition. So what is happening in diaspora. So my analysis is rather how the community is developing, and not just our community, but diaspora communities in itself, and look at them in a comparative approach. So what I've really realized as being part of the community is that the focus has always been, and for a very long time, been dominant by looking back at what is happening in Sri Lanka and how the political situation is developing and the social situation. But little focus is being given to what is happening with us here in diaspora. Yeah, and I think that's something which is very, very under-researched and needs to be given much more account.
On that note, as a final question, what advice do you have to the younger kids in our generation that are looking at studying the social sciences, the humanities, and they may face some resistance from their parents to study more technical subjects such as engineering, life science, and maths, business. What advice do you have for them who are looking to study this line of?
I think they should not be discouraged by the kind of reactions they face by society and by families, because I think Tamil society has very, very much been dominated by people who go into natural science or these typical kind of classified Tamil educational pathways. And as a community as a whole, we lack of people who are in the social science and who approach things in a different level.
That's right.
So I do think that the community itself needs to be more open towards the idea of accepting people who try to think differently, to approach our community differently, and to also give them the space to articulate. And people who do face these obstacles should not look basically discouraged by what is happening, but what is happening around them, what people think about their ideas of studies, but should think about people who actually have made their way, like Sivanandan, who have made their way in a very unconfirmed and non-normative way to approach what is happening to our people. So,
thank you, Sinthujan. That's the time we have for this segment. Dear viewers, please join us after the break for our third segment, where we'll discuss Mother's Day with a young mother and Sinthujan and Meena as well. Please join us. It is said, a mother is the